Hi, everyone. It's Father Eric. If you've been following the podcast or you're part of our local parish community, you probably know that our Lenten mission here at St. James in Colgan, Ontario, is about to start pretty soon. So as I'm recording this, the mission is about to begin basically tomorrow, right? So Monday, March 20th, 2023, with Mass here at St. James in Colgan, Ontario. So 3-day Lenten mission, so 3 consecutive nights, Mass again at 7 p.m., followed by adoration and benediction, no prior registration, and free of charge. Anyways, the plan was always to record each of those different nights of the mission and upload it to the podcast. And in anticipation of that particular endeavor, I decided to record one of the homilies during this past weekend, during the fourth Sunday of Lent, dealing with the problem of evil and whatnot, just for test purposes, to make sure that, the sound was okay and the visuals were tight and whatnot. But this particular reflection seemed to resonate with the parish community in a really striking sort of way. So even though I hadn't originally been planning to upload this to the actual podcast, I thought I would do so for your convenience and for your enjoyment. So given all that, I invite you now to just sit back and enjoy this, again, live recording of Season 4, Episode 17, on the subject of trust in the midst of darkness. As we work through the Bible, especially as we work from the Old Testament to the New, you find what Carl Newman talks about in terms of the development of doctrine. And it's not as if God's truth changes, right? God's truth is always eternal, immutable, and unchangeable, but what changes is our understanding. What changes and evolves is our understanding of that immutable truth. It deepens, and we appreciate how rich and complex God's truth always is, even though it remains unchangeable, right? So the analogy that always comes to mind, just think about like a diamond, right? So the diamond doesn't change, but our appreciation for what that diamond is changes and deepens and evolves over time as we turn it in the light and we look at it over a period of years even, right? So the development of doctrine. And certainly there are a lot of concrete examples we can draw upon to kind of make this thing a little bit real, but perhaps one of the most practical and relevant examples is what's called the problem of evil. The problem of evil, right? So the problem of evil is a philosophical thing, right? And it can be defined in all sorts of different ways, but I want to define it for you in a simple sort of way, just to make sure we're on the same page, right? So the whole idea is that God is supposedly all good, he's supposedly all powerful, and yet evil exists in the world. So what's up with that, right? So it would seem to be the case that God therefore is not all good and/or he's not all powerful. So again, God is supposedly all good and all powerful, and yet evil exists in the world. And just by virtue of the fact that evil exists in the world, it would seem to be the case that God is not all good and/or he's not all powerful. And that in turn begs the question, like, so what's the Christian response to all that, right? So again, we're still on the level of philosophy. And actually, the Christian response to the problem of evil is pretty tight. So this is a really good thing for us to keep in mind for our own selves, quite apart from how we explain it to other people. But you can kind of filter it down to 2 points, right? So first of all, this idea of evil, right? So evil is not a thing in the world. Evil is not a thing in the world. It's not a created thing in the world. Evil is what we might call a privation. It's an absence of something which should be there. There's some good in this particular circumstance which should be there, but it's not. So it's a privation, it's an absence, right? So easy example, illness is the absence of health. A cavity is the absence of teeth, right? So the absence of something which should be there, some tangible good, right? But the other point is basically this idea of God's active will versus his permissive will. So his active will is like when God actively wills some manner of good from his generative heart, right? So, let there be the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, right? So I actively will this thing to be the case. God's permissive will, though, is that something that he allows to happen, which is not part of his active will, but is permitted all the same, and remains within the context of his divine providence, right? So that's his permissive will. And that's a great way to understand today's gospel, right? Gospel of John chapter 9, the story of the man born blind. And so you'll notice that the story, it's pretty long. There's a longer version and there's a shorter version. And the bulk of it is about spiritual blindness, but to be honest, I didn't really want to talk about that. I wanted to talk about the problem of evil. But the problem of evil is all in the preface, but the preface only exists in the longer version. So I was trying to think of a way to have us look at the shorter version, but days away, we couldn't do it, right? So what we find in the preface, the apostles, they're wrestling with this Old Testament understanding of evil and the problem of evil, right? So the development of doctrine. So they come to the Lord, and basically, just to kind of frame what they're talking about or where they're coming from, They're laboring under this lingering Old Testament understanding that the reason why evil exists in the world is because of some manner of personal sin. So undue emphasis on the reality of personal sin bringing about evil in this world. A succinct way to put it is it's almost like looking at it as bad karma, right? So the way they frame it in the gospel is, why was this man born blind? Was it because he sinned or his parents sinned? So the idea is that when you look at this guy's family tree, someone must have committed some terrible personal sin, otherwise he wouldn't have been born blind. Now, certainly it's true that suffering and death and evil entered into the world through original sin. You think about Adam and Eve and that whole story in the book of Genesis, right? But that's different than personal sin. But that's what the disciples are looking for, right? So this man was born blind, certainly because, again, something was done wrong in the context of the immediate family tree. But you remember what the Lord says. It's a variation of, you have heard said to you this, but now I say to you that. Development of doctrine. So perhaps you've heard before that personal sin is the reason why evil exists in the world. But I say unto you now, the reason why this man was born blind is such that God's works might be revealed through him. The reason why this man was born blind was such that God's works might be revealed through him. A tangible example of God's permissive will. So the way it's framed is that God is so good, and he's so powerful, and he's so amazing, that if he permits any sort of evil to exist in this world, it's such that he might bring about a greater good. So again, the problem of evil, what's the Christian response, philosophically speaking, is two things. Evil is a privation. It's not a thing in the world. It's the absence of some good which should be there. And also this notion of God's permissive will. God is so great and powerful that if evil exists in the world, it's such that God might bring about a greater good. Okay. Now here's what gets kind of interesting, right? Because wisdom obtains in terms of the application of abstract principles to real-world situations. So I want to give you two bits of advice. One is it applies to other people, pastoral situations, and one is it applies to us, right? So first of all, with regards to other people, you need to keep in mind a really important distinction between problems on the one hand and mysteries on the other. Problems on the one hand and mysteries on the other. So problems, perhaps we might say, they are issues which have really easy solutions. That's one way to define a problem. So what's the problem here? Oh gosh, the light is out. What do we do? Oh my goodness, just change out the light bulb. Pretty simple issue, pretty easy solution. But mysteries are not like that. So mysteries are things like the mystery of love and suffering and death, and dare we say, the entirety of human life. And the idea is that when you approach pastoral situations, you need to recognize, okay, is this a problem or is this a mystery? And if it's a mystery, you don't treat it like a problem. So I'll give you an example. Right? Let's say you're with a friend, and your friend is in a funeral setting, and your friend's mother or father just died. The worst thing you could do is treat it like a problem. Well, the reason why your mother died is because God is so powerful that if he permits this thing to happen, it's for a greater good. Like, not helpful, not consoling. And you might get an unkind word in response, or maybe even a punch in the face, in which case you're wrestling with the mystery of suffering. You better hope people won't treat it like a problem, right? So you need to kind of rein that in, right? I think we do that. We try to treat mysteries like problems because, we feel better, But even though it sounds weird, and even though it is difficult, what you're supposed to do in that situation is, first of all, recognize this is a mystery. This person is wrestling with the mystery of suffering and death, and so therefore, what do I do? Even though it sounds hard, and even though it is actually painful, you need to let the person go through the mystery. You can't take it for them. You can't treat it like a problem. You need to let this person, your beloved friend, family member, or whatever, to go through the mystery, for example, of suffering and death. It's the image of Mary at the foot of the cross. So Jesus is going through the mystery of suffering and death in the context of the salvation of the world. And Mary's at the foot of the cross. And you know that she would take away his suffering. You know that she would die in his place, but that's not her place. She's meant to suffer in her own particular way. Jesus goes through this thing, I go through this thing, we're going through concurrent parallel mysteries, right? But more to the point, I need to let him go through that. That is what God the Father requires. Now, what do we do in the meantime, right? He's not alone, right? I'm journeying with him, so ministry of presence, right? At the same time, if problems happen to arise, you deal with that. So again, the funeral setting, my friend is going through a thing where, his father has died or his mother has died, right? I don't treat it like a problem. I let that person go through the mystery. I journey with him as he goes through this thing. But if problems happen to arise, the kids need to be fed, someone needs to be driven somewhere, someone needs to pick the funeral readings for the liturgy, well, I can help with that. So those are appropriate problems which arise incidental to the mystery. I'll give you another example just to kind of make this real, right? So this is a movie example. And a lot of times I raise movie examples based on movies that I like. This is a movie that I almost like, right? So it's called $1 Million Baby, Clint Eastwood movie, right? So Hilary Swank, Clint Eastwood. Hilary Swank plays this down-and-out young girl who's kind of grown up in really poor circumstances. And so poverty, her family's given up on her, society has given up on her, and she's just trying to find something to, pass the time. She calls herself trailer trash. It's just like really low self-esteem and all these things. And so initially she picks up boxing, again, just to pass the time. I got to find something to fill my days, so I'm just going to take up boxing in this, ratty old gym, right? And she runs into Clint Eastwood. And the Clint Eastwood character is a boxing trainer. And he quickly realizes that she's got talents. So at first, very reluctantly, he kind of takes her in and trains her and whatever, and she gets really good really fast. And it culminates in this title fight. So she's battling against the champion of the world, in this really climactic fight. And what happens, I think she turns her back, and the other person hits her in the back of the head, and she falls, and she hits her head on a stool, and she's paralyzed, quadriplegic, right? And she's in this bed. This is at the end of the movie, right? And she's basically talking to Clint Eastwood's character, and just kind of a paraphrase, right? She's like, look, my life is awful. Like, I used to be this, but now I'm that. I could have been the champion of the world, but now I'm this. And I'm not even back to what I was before. Before, I was just trailer trash. I was just poor. But now I'm paralyzed. Now I'm a quadriplegic, and my life is over. And again, my life is awful. So now I ask you, because I can't do it myself, you got to kill me. And so he kind of thinks about it for a bit, and then he kills her. And the credits roll, and you're like, what the heck is that? Right? So it's a movie I could have liked, but now I hate it. And it's one of those things. Just to kind of break it down based on what we're talking about today. Like, what was his problem? What was his error, right? The obvious one is, don't kill the people you love. So there's that, right? But the preliminary error, which leads to the fundamental error, is like, you treated the thing like a problem. You forgot about this distinction between mysteries and problems. So here's this person, again, this girl that I love, my life is over. I used to be this, now I'm that. My life is filled with suffering and pain. It would seem to be the only logical solution is that you help me end my life. What he's thinking is like, oh gosh, this is an intellectual nut that I can't crack. Maybe because I haven't studied philosophy, I haven't read that book about the mystery of suffering, and I don't know what to do, I'm not involved in pastoral practice, and so he's trying to think of an intellectual response to the problem of evil, but that's not what she needs. In that moment, she doesn't need a philosopher. What she needs is a friend. And we can all do that, right? What she needs is a friend to kind of show her, through words, but primarily through actions, you were loved, you were cherished. I know this is painful, and this is difficult, but you're not alone. I am your friend, and I love you, and I'll be with you to the end. That is what's required. But he doesn't see it, and that's why the movie's awful. So that's the whole thing with other people. But now it begs the question, what if it's me? What if I'm wrestling with the mystery of suffering and death? What's up with that? One real practical point, right? Even though it's true that God permits evil to bring about a greater good, so permissive will, at the same time, in terms of the what or the why, why is God permitting this particular thing? Who knows? Right? And you gotta learn to be okay with that. You gotta learn to be okay with that. We live in a space perpetually of I gots to know. You know what I mean? I can't give myself permission to live or to breathe or even take one step unless I have complete intellectual mastery of my situation. And it's whoever said that was part of the deal? It's not. It never was. It never was. God will never invite you to a level of intimacy with him which doesn't require you to trust and surrender to him. Trust is part of the deal. You can't have intimacy without deep trust, especially when it comes to our relationship with God, right? John Paul II talks about this, right? So the way he frames it, it's very interesting. He says, God will never give you an intellectual answer to the reason why you're suffering. And why is that? Just to ponder that for a second. It's not because God's trying to be a celestial killjoy, right? It's because it is never that simple. A lot of times we have this thing where the reason why this happened was because of this, and maybe that's true, but a lot of times that comes from our desire to know. Again, I guts to know, right? But it betrays the fact or overlooks the fact that it's no small thing to the Lord that you actually suffer. Like when we're going through hard times, it's just like, oh, this is awful. I'm going through this, that, and the other thing. You think it means a lot to you. It means a lot to the Lord. Precious in the eyes of the Lord is the death of his faithful. If the Lord permits any manner of suffering and death to befall you or your loved ones, be it a paper cut or a serious prolonged illness, it is a big deal to the Lord. And it's because he's trying to bring about something amazing and wide-spanning and magical and powerful in terms of bringing about the salvation of the world. That's why, whenever we're like, okay, like why is this happening? I want to know about this corresponding to that. It's never that simple. God never takes these things lightly. So in the absence of that, even just imagine intellectually, I'm going through this thing, okay, God doesn't want me to have this intellectual answer to why I'm suffering. So what's left? What's left is an invitation. You need to recognize that this is an invitation to receive this vocation to participate in the work of salvation. Here's a small part of God's salvific and holy cross that he wants me to carry right now in time and space. Do I recognize it as such? And do I rise to the challenge? Now again, John Paul II expounds upon this. He goes, look, even if you recognize it and you rise to the challenge and you accept the vocation to participate in the work of salvation by carrying a small piece of the cross, even then, your suffering will not go away. It won't even diminish, perhaps, right? But what will happen, it's kind of interesting. In the midst of my suffering and pain and confusion and death, somehow, in the midst of that, I have a deeper conviction that my life has meaning and my pain has purpose. And again, precious in the eyes of the Lord, the death of his faithful. Okay, I'm going to give you one final example. This is from my own life, right? So if you follow Catholic Latte on social media, you probably noticed that I posted a version of this a week ago. I meant to kind of post it kind of congruous with this particular homily, but I was excited, And after I posted it, I thought about it. It's like, it's not quite what I wanted to say. It's in the ballpark, but it's not quite what I wanted to say. But that's the advantage of coming to church, right? So anyways, some of you know this, but perhaps not. Back in the day, in 1996, my father died of liver cancer. And we had a number of priests, 2 priests in particular, who really journeyed with him and my mother and our family during that really, really difficult time. And one priest, he just showered my father with all sorts of sacraments and graces and blessings. So my father hadn't been baptized, actually. And so he baptized my father, gave him confirmation, anointing the sick, apostolic pardon, so the whole 9 yards, like really amazing. And there was another priest who said, look, I know you guys aren't going to church. That's a homily for a different day, right? But we weren't going to church. And so he's like, look, what are we going to do? Traditionally, there's a recommended fee with regards to funerals, but I'm going to waive it, but just try your best to go to Mass, right? And it's funny to imagine, to have those 2 priests journey with us in that particular way over a long period of time, because my dad was sick for a long time, right? And that was very impactful on our family and on me. So much so that when it came to the seminary application, they asked these bunch of questions. Are you crazy or whatever? But 2 of them are like, what's the best thing to happen to you? And what's the worst thing to happen to you? And I wasn't trying to be clever or poetic. It was just what comes to mind. And so what I said was, the best thing that happened to me and the worst thing that happened to me, it's the same thing. It's the death of my father. The best thing and the worst thing that happened to me was the death of my father. It was the best thing because it brought us back to the Lord Jesus Christ, our entire family. And Jesus Christ is amazing, right? So obviously, yeah, there's that. It was the worst thing, though, for obvious reasons. And here's where it gets kind of, here's where dovetails are, right? So I talk about that in terms of the video that I posted on social media, but I was thinking about it afterwards. I was like, here's the thing I kind of wanted to say that I'm sharing with people right now in the context of the weekend. I'm be careful how I phrase this, right? Even though it's true that my dad's death brought us back to church, I would say that it's a bit of an understatement to say that the reason why God permitted my dad's death and all those things was simply that we might go back to church, right? That was a part of it, and I appreciate that, right? But you think about everything we went through. My dad was sick for a really, really long time. He suffered for a really long time. Never mind what my mom went through and what my family went through. And I haven't talked to my dad since 1996. And so it's not just this generic thing. It's just those are really significant things. And I've had to think about it and pray into it. And what's kind of come to me is that the reason why all that stuff was permitted to happen was not simply such that we might be saved. The reason why God permitted all that stuff was such that people might be saved. Now, again, I don't want to be simplistic or reductionist here, right? But just to focus on priesthood, just to kind of keep it simple, right? We don't go back to Mass. I don't go to the seminary. If I don't go to the seminary, I don't become a priest, and we're not having this conversation, right? So never mind like Oshawa, Brampton, North York, right? But just to think about it, like what can God do with one more priest on the grid? Even if all he does is like, say the Mass and hear confessions and minister the sacraments, that's a really, really big deal. Now, when I reflect on my own experience, I mean, certainly I can think of tangible examples where I'm doing ministry, and it's just, okay, I can see, I think, how this is benefiting, like, this person or these people in some tangible way. And the Lord gives us stuff like that, right? Just to kind of give us a sense of encouragement, to remind us that our lives have purpose and meaning and stuff. But in terms of, like, what God is actually doing, not simply through my vocation, but through this whole thing of, like, suffering and death in my life and the lives of my family, I have no idea. I have no idea. But you know what? I am totally fine with that, right? But in light of all the stuff we're talking about today, like, what is the Lord actually inviting me to do? I'm invited to trust, and I'm invited to surrender to the fact that if God deprives me of the company of my Father, even for a single day, it's because he's doing something amazing and beautiful and powerful in terms of bringing about the salvation of the world. And I gotta tell you, friends, I can live with that.